So the more like podcasting stuff that I do, the more receptive I am to the different ways that people share information on podcasts, to the different techniques people use to produce certain effects on podcasts, to the kinds of research that people do that they present on their podcasts. I'm increasingly more receptive to those things, and I can speak them. I can tell you that this show is doing this kind of thing, right? So so now that you are like, I'm a podcaster, I'm getting down, then your listening becomes more critical. And the reason that this is important is because you have to be a lot more receptive to the structure of a show or of podcasts in general, so that you can make choices about what the structure of your show will be. Some at the beginning, people will say like, oh well, this is going to be like an interview style podcast. Okay, that's great, but there's like bazillions of different ways to do interview styles, right? Like that. So even if you're saying it's an interview show, that isn't even like a quarter of the way to like what the show is going to be like, right? Is an interview show like, you know how you hear Death, Sex, and Money, where the interview is broken up into these like certain types of sections, and then you'll hear it's Anna Sale, right? That's Death, Sex, and Money. She shows up in the middle and like does some contextual stuff and dips back into the interview, and the interview flows like it's kind of beautiful the way that it flows. It's kind of amazing, right? So that's one way to do the interview show. Another way is to have maybe there's two people in there doing the interview. Maybe the interviewee is prepped in a certain kind of way. Maybe you're very careful about what kind of information that you're trying to get from interviewee. Like there are so many ways to do things, and you can hear that, especially if you listen to, if you maybe there's like a certain person that's a public figure that you like, and you listen to a bunch of shows that have them in it, and you can hear all the different ways that that person comes across given the show that they're on. These things are cluing you in to the different ways that shows are structured. Okay. So in the description of your show, then you need to be able to state what the structure of the show is. And if you're very receptive to how other podcasts play, then you will be able to make more specific and narrower statements about what the structure of your show is, right? And to that end, it's often very helpful um, to use other shows as a way of explaining your show, right? So you might want to be like, well, it's the structure of Love and Radio, but it's the content of the Milk Street Food podcast. And so that can help people immediately go, okay, I can get this on a basic level. Now tell me what the show is. All right. And then you have to describe, of course, like what the show is straight up. And there are many ways to do this, but there's just no substitute for writing down what you think the show is, explaining it to others, and having them explain it back to you. Because what ends up happening is that you explain the show to others, they explain it back to you, and you're like, no, that's not what I'm saying. And if the thing that they explained back to you isn't what you felt like you told them, you need to adjust what you said to them. Does that make sense? So there's no there's no substitute for this. There's no like perfect statement from the outset. There's none of that. Now, I mean, you know, there are these like podcasty geniuses out here that don't really do a lot of explaining, right? So I did this thing with Ian Chillag, who a show called Everything Is Alive, you know, and I'd known him for a couple years, and on occasion he would talk about the show, but I never fully understood what he was doing, right? But he was a super pro podcast genius, and so like he could just make the thing and say, this is what we're doing, and then we all went, oh, and then gave him a bunch of awards, right? But usually That's not how it rolls for most of us. For most of us, we have to be very specific about what the show is. Now, I will say this about describing the show. It's best to describe the show 3 ways. That is, describe the show in a tweet length, describe the show in a paragraph, and describe the show in a page. This is a very good way we found to get right for yourself and others what the show is. Okay. I guess I'm gonna. Oh, and then I guess the last thing that I want to say about this is that it's important to tell others and yourself why the show matters. Because if you care about it, we might care about it. So it's important to tell us why the show matters. Okay. Next thing, describe the audience. Now, once again, among the things that are important about the pitch, knowing who your audience is so major, because knowing who your audience is will tell you what kinds of choices to make, once again, in the production process. If you know that you're talking to students, who are like freshmen, then you know that there are certain things that you can expect them to know and certain things you cannot expect them to know. So that there are certain contexts you have to provide and some that you don't. Now, of course, it's very easy to just define an audience generally. And I think this is kind of a mistake. I think that you want to just define your audience as narrowly as possible, to the point where you can imagine a person that you know as being your audience. So it's like, I want to make a podcast for Brett. Now, Brett is a member of a demographic, right? Like, Brett is at the center of a Brett-shaped Venn diagram, right? With all manner of other stuff happening. But if you can always think of the person that you're making the show for, that is, it's so helpful. It's so helpful, because otherwise you're going to get lost, because you're going to interview like a professor person, and then like just you're going to interview a grandma, and you're going to interview, someone in the service industry. And so now there's all these different voices that you've got, but to whom are you directing them to speak? Well, to Brett. And so because you know about Brett and his demographic, then you can make those edits. You can do the things you need to do. You can say, oh, can you explain what that means? I don't think Brett gets what that is. So if you do all of that, then your audience will then they'll be keyed in. Like, you'll be able to reach them properly. You can't really think of a general audience. Does that make sense? You can't think a general audience, but you can think a person or a small group of friends. And so that's what I suggest you do. Define the audience as narrowly as possible, and then pick a person that you know that would be in that group, and then just make the show for them. Okay. And then the last thing is describe the first few episodes. Now, this is also an opportunity for you to learn what your show is about, because on the one hand, it's a test to see like what are the legs that your show has? Like, how long can it be sustained? Do you have an idea for like one-off episode thing, or like, is this going to go on for 10 episode season, or do you want this to be ongoing forever? Whatever it is, you need to be able to summarize the first few episodes. Now, these episodes are essentially mini pitches for themselves. So what does that mean? So it means that you're not just writing down episode 1, the history of motorcycles at the beach. You're not doing that. You're writing the entire story arc. You're writing the straight up details that your show, that this episode needs in order to be itself. So in other words, it's a spoilers review. So you're writing a spoilers review of Titanic. You're writing a spoilers review. Does that make sense? So it's all of the details that you need. And what that means is that you're doing all of the preliminary research necessary in order to be able to write this. So you're doing pre-interviews, you're calling people, you're going to the archives, you're doing the research. You're essentially doing the work, more or less, of making these episodes at the research level so that you can write what these episodes are. That's the only way you're going to be able to properly put down on paper what these episodes are. And when you do that, you're going to realize some things about your show. Maybe in the third episode, something about the topic doesn't quite fit what you've been saying, and you're going to be like, "Oh, I should expand the topic as it is laid down in my description of the show, so that shows like this can happen." You'll realize these things as you're doing the research and prepping for these different episodes. This is the way that I look at it. Can you dig it?
I'm digging it.
I'm so happy.
Great information. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. And as I say, you're going to put that all into a document, and then you're going to go and explain it to people, and then they're going to explain it back to you, and you're going to say no, and then you're going to change some stuff. You're also going to, as you, before you hit production, constantly explain the show to yourself, like literally fresh sheet of paper, write down what the show is anew, right? These are like I'm a philosopher, so like I'm a continental philosopher. The idea of the hermeneutic circle is a major thing. So in order to understand the parts, you have to understand the whole, but in order to understand the whole, you have to understand the parts. So this is essentially a dialectical statement that says that there is no singular statement. There's only ever revisions that are like tested against each other all the time. So the revision process has to be like moving until it's finally time to start your production plan. Then that's a whole other thing. Do I have example documents? Oh, I do, but I don't have them. I don't have them pulled up. Also, can I publicly reveal them? I'm not sure. But I will say that they are around on AIR, Association for Independence and Radio. Like there's pitch stuff there. Yeah, and maybe I can find something while we are talking about your pitches. With that, I would love to hear your pitches, or we would love to hear your pitches, so that we can all provide feedback on it. Actually, this is a super cool thing, because it's very rare that those of us who are at the beginning of the pitch process can get like a squad of people who are all interested in audio production in the same space. And so I hope that you recognize how amazing it is to have just a bunch of cats that care about audio here to listen and ask you questions about your pitch. So let's go ahead and let's do it.
Great. And then we also have Eliza's here to comment on pitches as well. Eliza, do you want to introduce yourself real quick, and then we'll jump right into the first one?
Yeah, sure. I'm Eliza. I'm a radio producer. I have worked at lots of different shows. Right now, I'm leading new narrative podcasts for New York Magazine. But before that, I was at Planet Money, and before that, I was at Invisibilia.
Is that
and I also make independent work.
Like I know who you are.
What'd you say?
Well, because I saw your name on the thing, and I was like, do I know this person, or have they been on emails? And I was like racking my brains. But Planet Money.
No, we've never met. But hi.
Yes, but like my two like favorite shows. Surprise. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm excited to hear pitches. It's very exciting. I as an independent producer, I really like just like weird stories. I feel like I've worked on pretty like normal narrative shows, but I really love like weird narrative stuff. So I'm excited to hear about people's ideas.
That's awesome. We're in such a lucky place to have everyone here, as Chioki was saying. Giselle, how do you feel about going first? I'm only doing this because I have so much like faith in the project you've been working on. So
I can go first. I'm not a stranger to being voluntold to do things, so I can get started. So, hi everyone. My name is Giselle Bello. I am New York City native, Afro-Latina, first generation medical student, currently a fourth year medical student at Brown. And I have started the podcast You Are Med. So I'm gonna just go into this and I guess we'll see how we go from there. Sounds good? Okay. As people from diverse backgrounds in medicine, one of the first labels we get is underrepresented in medicine, or URM. Ironically, a designation meant to carve a space for us is also the same designation that makes us feel othered. Our conversations are designed to breathe life into the nuances that are flattened by data points med schools use on their websites, nuances that add color and expand on the journey that we took to be here. You Are Med is a collection of stories from the heart about experiences of underrepresented medical students. It captures the challenges, nuances, and magic of what it means to be underrepresented in medicine. You Are Med provides a soft landing space for underrepresented trainees, a refuge from the harsh, perfectionistic medical environment. Our intention is that you find pieces of yourself in the stories of others, and that this makes you feel less alone, more inspired, and uplifted. And now my hands are shaking and my heart is pounding because I said that to a whole bunch of people who I don't know.
Oh my goodness. Well, I think it sounds dope, and I think that actually. Wait, hello?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was like, oh dear, am I on mute? It's happening again. No, I think it sounds dope, and also I feel like, you know, one of the reasons that we do sessions like this is to get more comfortable doing sessions like this, right? Like, I think that that fundamental anxiety that you speak to is exactly the kind of thing that we want to extinguish on our way to making stuff, because the more comfortable we are with like kind of being out there with our weirdness or like our ideas, the easier it will be to bring the ideas into the world. So I think that, you know, you've crossed a major threshold, and, you know, by the next time you do this, you'll be like, you know, smoking a vape pen, being like, here's my show, whatever, you know. Would I be right in assuming that the show, as you describe it, is for other med students who are classified URM?
Yes. Other med students, as med students, we were pre-meds before being med students, and then after med students will be residents. So it's basically for medical people who feel underrepresented in medicine.
Yes. And do you have a notion of how many people there are in the med school system that have that designation?
Yes.
What is that?
You mean currently at Brown, or like just general in life?
I think that I mean, generally speaking, America, but I might also kind of mean like maybe like Anglophone or whatever like language the show is going to be in. So I'm just trying to get a sense of what the size of that audience is.
I think if you take like all of medical applicants in the United States and then you funnel them out to be URMs, I think it's something like 12 to 15% of students that apply actually end up matriculating into medical school. Yeah. I think a force is like 20%, but that's forcing it.
I see. And how will the show sound? Which is to say, like, I think that I heard that you're part of it is telling stories.
Mhm.
So give me an example of, an episode.
And if you want to share, you can. I've given you
Okay.
sharing permissions too, so I don't know if you wanted to play anything, but I didn't mean to volunteer
Oh,
you
wow.
again.
Okay.
Well, you don't have to.
Yeah. Okay. So, one of the, so wait, let me do one thing before, I'm going to share the link tree thing here. The first episode that I put out was my story, because I felt like it felt weird for me to be out here asking people to tell their stories and be very vulnerable in their experiences in medicine and what that means for them as future physicians if I didn't first tell part of my story. So I talked a little bit about, my own experiences in medicine. And then the second episode is with this woman named Elizas, who is a third-year medical student at BU. And she shares a lot of her stories around why it matters for her as a Black woman and as a daughter of immigrants to be in medicine, what it looks like to be let into spaces that are very vulnerable spaces because she is a Black woman, meaning like with patients and stuff. And yeah, I feel like I'm blabbing, so I'm gonna stop there.
Sorry, I just have one more question.
Yeah.
Liza, I know that you have some questions as well. Can you tell me a bit about what your story is in episode 1?
Yes. I grew up in Harlem. I grew up in the projects. I wanted to go into medicine from having the experiences of growing up with a severely depressed mom and being a 9-year-old child trying to figure out like how to fix my mom, how to make my mom be happier and all of that. And then being met with like being the only person that understood English and Spanish in my family. And so having to be the translator for my grandmother and my mom during their doctor's appointments. And then looking around and seeing that like the people who were in my community were doing not as great as the people that were just like 10 blocks down the street in Columbia, who had resources and had like a totally different kind of lifestyle. And so I sort of decided that medicine was my way, but I had no fucking clue what I was doing. I had no one to guide me through that process. And the more I learned about medicine, the more injustices I saw, the more I saw reflections of myself, my own family, my community, and like the more tied to being a physician I became.
And when you tell this story, is it told as a monologue? Is it like telling like a short kind of biography? How does the story unfold on the podcast itself?
So I had 2 of my mentees interview me so that they could just ask me whatever questions they wanted to know about my story so that I could actually just tell them the story and it didn't feel so contrived, like me just sitting in my makeshift little studio at home with my mic being like, and then I did this. So it's me telling my story to my mentees. And yes, I am Dominican Tony.
And last thing, I swear.
Yeah, it's okay.
So as it plays out, are we going to hear your mentees asking you the questions,
Yeah.
or will it? Okay, so it will sound. It will be kind of like an interview thing, where your mentees are fundamentally the hosts for this episode, or they kind of have that role. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Okay. I'm gonna think about this, Liza.
Well, I guess for me, like, it seems like you're already doing the thing, like you're doing it, and it makes sense. And I think it seems like you have a really clear idea of like who the show is for and what purpose it serves, which is so important. And so many people don't have that. And I think like like the fact that, you know, like it would have been helpful for me to have
Mhm.
this show in my life. And then you're like making that show. I feel like that's just like such a good starting place. Yeah. And as I was listening, I had the same question as Chioke, like, is it an interview show, or do you want it to be more like narrated stories? And I guess my question for you is just like, kind of like, what's the most helpful feedback? Like, what do you want? What are your biggest questions for like, moving forward in the show? Because it seems like you're already making a show that's good. I think that Brown should pay you to make it. Like,
Thank you.
It seems like is that the goal? Because I feel like you have a compelling case. Like, what's the most helpful thing for you to get specific feedback on?
I think that is sort of exactly it, that I created this show because I needed it. And anytime that I had some sort of slip up in my journey to medicine, the stories that made me feel like I could continue forward were the stories of people who also had a similar slip up and just shared that with me, right? So it made me feel like I wasn't totally invalidated in wanting to continue to pursue medicine. And so I want to be able to capture people's stories, to be able to share them with like the next generation of future physicians. And I would love to be paid to just like gather stories and learn how to interview people in a way that like gets them to go to that place to really share this emotional piece with us, and then, you know, share that in a really beautiful way that honors them, their story, their journey.
Yeah, I think if I were you, like, I might, if I was pitching this to get money for it, I might start with the thing that you just said. Like, tell a story about a moment when during your time in med school where you really needed to hear something like this, where you turn to the stories of other people who had been in similar positions and you gain something from that. Because I think like it's just so powerful, and it makes the need for the show so obvious. Yeah. Yeah. And then I guess my other question is like, how produced do you want it to be? Like, how much do you want it to be just like a straight interview that is just like, you sat down, you talked for an hour and you published it? Or how much do you want to edit it and make it sort of like cut it up, change the order?
Yeah. So I have interviewed people, and again, like, this is just me being like, I'm trying to make this happen. And you were cracking me up when you were giving us like your pieces of advice, Choke, because I was like, yeah, I just approached this so blind, and have been, you know, finding it's been a very steep learning curve. But and because I said that, I actually just forgot what your question was. So can you ask me your question again? Sorry.
Just in your dream version of the show, is it a straight interview?
The editing,
or is it like
right.
More highly produced?
It's not highly produced, but it's not just a straight up interview, because I think that part of my work when I'm interviewing people is like helping them get comfortable enough to go there and share a story. And so it's edited, but not super highly edited. Yeah.
Cool. Sure, do you have more thoughts?
I think that I want to, I guess, make a case, right? So if episode 1, your mentees are asking you the question, so I understand the value of having someone ask you the question so that you can speak to someone as opposed to kind of monologuing yourself in your closet. Believe me, I've spent many a day in my closet. It sucks, right? But I suppose that if the first episode would then feature these voices who wouldn't necessarily be the voices of the podcast. Does that make sense?
Right.
Because they're like your mentees, and like those cats are probably different cats next year or whatever it is, whatever the reasons are. Like they wouldn't be the voices of the show. And then secondly, I think that your story, or probably the story of anyone you talk to, would be perfectly sufficient on its own as a narrative, like as a story recounted, but like non-narrated. So I guess I would like you to consider producing a non-narrated version of the show where you are. So what you do is, yes, someone asks you questions and you recount your story to people. But what we hear is just you talking and some music. And I have an example of it. Sorry, there's a show.
That scares
one of my
me.
one of my professor friends was on this show. It's called Interstitial. So it's one example of what this can sound like. There's another show that's called Love and Radio, which is like the greatest podcast ever made. That also has the same kind of format. But the basic idea, I think, is that the story by itself can speak for itself and may not need any help, right?
Okay.
From a host or from someone to provide the context or that kind of thing. Another way to think about it is to have that thing, what we're saying, the non-narrated story, and then play that for another person, like the person who's going to be telling the story on the next podcast, but then record them reacting to your non-narrated story and then tack that to the end of the show, so that we have the story and then we have another URM designated person reflecting on it. Next episode, that person is telling the story and then another person is reflecting on the story at the end. This is just a thought, but one of the things that I think that we do whenever we hear pitches is we try and figure out how we can hear the show in our own heads. And that's what I'm hearing as I listened to you explain the show.
I think that's so smart as an idea. I also, like, when I hear you talk about the show, I'm like, oh, it's so cool that you're making that. And also, I'm sure you're so busy.
Yeah.
And like, I think the production method that Chioke just talked about is a really cool in between, where you can make like a beautiful like narrative thing without doing the step of like writing, narration, and sort of like cutting it all together. It's sort of a mid place between super highly produced and raw. And I think it could be like, you could do a lot of justice to your stories that way. I was also wondering, this is a bit technical, but I don't know how you're, what kind of software you're using to produce right now. But I really love this software called Descript, which is, so you put in your raw tape, your interview, and it transcribes everything for you automatically. But it's attached to the audio, so it's not just a paper transcript, it's a transcript that is attached to a file. And so you can sort of edit the story on paper. You can be like, oh, actually, I want this chunk of tape at the beginning. You can edit that on a paper transcript, and then it will change the audio so that it matches the transcript that you write. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's
that would be so helpful.
It's really helpful because you don't have to go into like Pro Tools or whatever. You can just like make this thing. And yeah, you can play around. You can even play around with like scoring in there and stuff too. But it's also really nice. It's just like fast and simplifies everything. I'm very dependent on it.
Yes, that sounds like I should do that too.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna put in the link to it.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent move. Very, very good way to go. I think that Eliza is also right that the way that you explain the show needs to be a little bit different, right? So starting with why it matters is right. So the podcast is called URM.
You are med. So it's
You
a
are
play on the
med.
URM acronym.
You are med. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So You Are Med is the show about the things that I needed to hear when I became a medical student.
Mm.
And each episode tells the story of a UR Med student. That's right. So you noted something that I felt its truth, but I couldn't describe its truth, which is to say that the UR Med classification is like a thing it's supposed to be helpful, but actually it's not, or like it has this negative
Right.
effect. How so?
Well, because I think that like I'm Dominican, I grew up in Harlem, I'm a URM, right? And I was literally on the phone today with someone who is trying to be a medical student, who's a guy from Ghana, kid of immigrants, grew up in Ohio, right? And so there are a lot of commonalities between our stories, but I feel like just like putting us in the same bucket and being like, these are our URMs. I think it's,
see.
you know, is used like a thing for med schools to be like, look, 20% of our class are URMs, but really like that doesn't really tell you anything about our process here. And there are other URMs who don't have like the struggle story, right? So it just is a much more mixed bag that just this one designation doesn't do justice for.
I see. So the URM designation crushes intragroup differences and essentially makes them those differences unrecognizable to the institution that created this designation in order to serve them.
Right. So
Okay,
then therefore they make these blanket approaches to how to take care of us, but really it doesn't work for all of us. But they checked it off and now they're doing the thing, but they're not really doing it correctly. You know?
I see. So You Are Med is a podcast about the diversity underneath the label.
Exactly.
Okay.
I wrote that down.
No, it's good. It's just like so I think that what that means is that part of the description of the show should have like maybe a couple mini stories about how you encountered the medical education establishment and about how another person encountered it and about how none of you were served by the UR Med designation. Yeah. This is great. I mean, this is pretty cool. Any other thoughts? Anyone at all, I guess? Oh, we should probably get moving, huh? Because we have just two more.
I feel like
Thank
Brown
you
will
so
pay you to
much.
do this. It's like, why would they not? It just seems like it's such a service and also like a really beautiful and smart idea. I don't know.
Yeah.
No, it's
Thank
great.
you.
It's totally great. And I guess I was also thinking that one of the things that this could be, insofar as you have access to stories and people that want to tell them, is to have a look at any other medical podcasts out there and see if you can pitch them essentially an episode of your show.
Yeah.
Because I think that, as you know, the number one way to get people to listen to your show is to cross promote it on other shows. But I think that insofar as I know that there's tons of medical, related podcasts, that it might be good to go around and see what they're into and if they would want to have you on, maybe to just tell your story or simply to feature an episode of your show.
Totally. Or if one of the stories that you hear from one of the people that you interview turns out to be particularly like gripping or narrative, you could convert that into a more narrative type of episode to pitch somewhere to a bigger show and use that also too. You could like change the form a bit and then use that to funnel listeners back towards your regular show. Because I think you will be running into really
Thank you
like
so
special
much.
and unique
My
stories
hands are
that people wouldn't have heard.
Right. Thank you all
Excellent.
so much. I
I-
appreciate it.
I see Linda's hand is up. Did you want to unmute yourself and give a comment or something?
Yeah, so thank you so much for the presentation and your pitch. So I was wondering when you said that we should describe our pitch to somebody, one of our friends, should we describe it to the person that we think we're writing the podcast for, or who do you think we should ask, or just because I don't know anybody who do podcasting, so.
Yeah. Okay. So this is an excellent question. And so just very quickly, it can be a bit of a trap to describe the show to people that maybe don't know like anything about podcasts or don't listen to podcasts, because they tend to be like, oh, it sounds good. And then like, it's not like terribly helpful. Right.
Yeah.
So it is true that you want to be on guard. What you can do though is you can describe the entire first or first couple episodes to them, and then you just look at their reaction to your description of the episodes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see. That makes sense. Okay.
So once again, you're not just saying, oh, this episode's going to be about, but you're actually telling them, you're giving them the spoilers synopsis of the episodes to see how it is that they respond to it. And if they're like, oh, it seems fine, then you go back to the drawing board and you're like, where's my spice at? But otherwise, that's one way to do it. And then the next thing that you do is you find people that either love podcasts or like to produce podcasts, and then you explain it to them.
Awesome. I wasn't as prepared for all the 3 steps that you gave today, but when everybody gives their pitch, if you guys still have time, I would love to.
All right.
All right. Well,
Thank you.
Tino, are you ready to go next?
Sure.
Sweet.
So I guess to preface before I begin, I guess my questions that people can think about is, I guess, when is the right time to pitch, and possibly where to pitch this podcast. So hi, everyone. My name's Tino. I'm a third-year medical student also at Brown. Big plug and congratulations to Giselle's podcast, which launched this month. Everyone should go listen to it. I make a podcast called Firsts, which is about first-time medical experiences in medical training. So med students transition quickly from being members of the public to practicing medicine. In my podcast, I wanted to share with the public those many moments that transform students into doctors. So in my first year of medical school, I started to write personal narratives about the first time I held a heart in anatomy lab, the first time that I witnessed birth during my OB-GYN rotation, and the first time I lost a patient. I wove together my narration with interviews from family, med students, doctors, and researchers. I also delved into topics like food insecurity among medical trainees and racism that med students of color face. Emotions like sadness, anger, and joy are not prioritized in medicine as much as objectivity, numbers, and data, but I don't shy away from sharing my own emotional experiences in the hopes that my own vulnerability will help give space for others to open up about their firsts. Many of you must have listened to NPR's Invisibilia. My podcast is the structure of Invisibilia, but focuses on the experiences of medical training. The target audience is med students, pre-meds, physicians, and anyone close to someone who works in medicine. I have 5 episodes out now. I'm working on a 6th, and I'm spending a year after my 3rd year of medical school working on podcasting and research. I want to create a 2nd season with 8 episodes, each about 30 minutes in length. Some example ideas that I just came up with. First dates will share love stories of folks who met in medical school. First tweet will tell the story of me getting onto Twitter and into the networking world of med Twitter. And first words will be about learning the language of medicine. Thanks for your time.
Oh boy. Thank you so much. Eliza, would you like to go first?
Okay, sure. I can start. It sounds so good. It sounds really exciting. And I feel like, well, I have questions, but a thing that I felt like I really got a sense of from the way that you were speaking about the show was just like your tone as I assume that you're the host, and that you're bringing a lot of sort of like honesty and depth and like poetry to these topics, which is really exciting to me.
Thank you.
I guess my questions, just so I like understand better. Can you talk a little bit more about like the format of the show? Like
Sure.
how do each of the episodes sort of sound? Are they narrated or not?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
what's
So
going on with
they're
them?
narrated, and I take like highlights or thematic clips from interviews that I do and do my best to tie it into like a narrative arc. So I guess the best way of talking about that is like just talking about one of the episodes that I've made.
Yeah.
So I made an episode about, I talked a little bit about the episode about witnessing birth for the first time and being part of that. And so I first talk about my experience with helping with that. And then I talk to my grandmother, who shares a story about surviving a train crash while she was pregnant with my mom. And then my mom talks about her first two pregnancies. The first was a miscarriage, and the second was of a successful delivery of my older sister, Anna. And then I end the episode with a phone call to my mom, telling her, kind of reiterating to the beginning about my witnessing of birth for the first time, just to kind of close the loop on it. And then I just kind of have like an outro. So.
And are you sort of narrating through the whole thing, or is it a bit more like stylistically experimental? Are you like telling an essay throughout the whole thing?
Yeah, exactly. I narrate the whole thing. So it's kind of grounded in my perspective, but I definitely let like the people I interview like tell their stories.
It's a really interesting format because it seems like you're sort of using other people's perspectives or like experiences that aren't quite the same thing to bring more texture to your thing that you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think I try to do that because I want my audience to be medical people, but I also want people who aren't in medicine to be interested in it as well. And I think that's a way of like bringing other people into it too.
Yeah. Can you just give like a couple more examples of what the episodes are, just so that we have?
Yeah, so I made another episode about doing anatomy lab, like human dissection. So I talk about, so in that episode, the first story I share is me going into a cafe and seeing someone who looks similar to the person I'm doing human dissection on, and how like disturbing that was for me. And then I kind of talked to a couple other med students about their different experiences in anatomy lab. And then I talked to a professor who leads an anatomy course at Yale and talks about how he tries to be conscious of students' emotions when they're doing dissections, and how he tries to like incorporate like humanistic lessons for med students in the anatomy lab.
Yeah, I think so. My first instinct, and then I'll pass the baton, but basically my thought is that, well, I think a lot of people would tell you like stick with one story. Like each of these episodes should just be like one narrative, and they should just be like, here's the moment where I went into the cafe, blah, 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 and sort of stick to that traditional thing. But I think that what you're going for is more interesting, and you can make it work. Like it's really interesting to fold all these different experiences into the topic. I would like be cognizant of the fact that the specific narrative will help people track. Like people will stay in the story if you have a specific narrative that they can sort of like follow along. So
yeah.
I would just be attentive to that. And like, for example, the episode that you just talked about, like I would really tell the story about the cafe and make sure that you're returning to that story as you go through the episode, and like end the episode also in that story, you know, like if like totally. I think there's a way to stray from your narrative and fold in all these other parts and make that have a really cool texture, but like the audience does need something to cling to, like a string to attach to.
Okay. Yeah.
And
no, that's a really good point.
yeah, like your voice has to be strong in there.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, I
The
don't-
next episode that I'm working on, the episode about patient loss, and I think that one will be more focused on one person's story. And she just talks about how while she was on an elective in palliative care, her grandmother was dying at the same time, and she kind of talks about, I don't want to go into too much detail, but she kind of talks about how valuable hospice care was for her, and just kind of talked about how positive an experience that was, even though like it was in the context of her grandmother dying, how great hospice care was. But I think I want to focus on that one story, kind of like what you're saying,
Mhm.
just so that it's in one arc that people can follow.
Okay,
Thank you.
I'm
Whoa,
done for
boy.
now. Do you have thoughts, Cherokee?
I mean, yeah, okay. So I have a lot of thoughts here. I think that I had, Eliza, the same fundamental tension that you had when you heard the description of the first episode, about like, Tino, you're witnessing a birth. I think that the thing that is different, and probably why you were like, oh, I can, grandma and mom can be a part of this, is because birth is kind of something that everybody has a fundamental access to, which is to say that, like, lots of people witness birth, lots of people give birth, lots of, what I'm saying, like, so
Yeah.
there's that whole jam. And so then fundamentally it's not as insane an experience as, by way of an example, holding a human heart, right?
Yeah.
If I hold a human heart, things have gone wrong, right? Like, there are tanks in the streets, there might be some aliens flying, you see what I'm saying?
Mhm.
And so I think that there's and then you describe patient loss, which is like major, in which only a doctor can do, and you describe human dissection, which, once again, unless we're in a Eli Roth movie, like, okay, anyway, so what's my point? I would like you to consider removing like the experiences where the commonality is too close. So witnessing a birth, the commonality is too, I mean, I've been around like 12 or so births. The mother of my daughter is a midwife. I played
Okay.
drums at a birth one time. It was pretty
Wow.
chill, actually, right? But my point is that, like, I can access that very quickly. Can't nobody but doctors access human dissection. You see what I mean? Or like the like the funeral home people, right? And so, okay, now, so let's consider those things that are unique to being a doctor, or being in that field, like dealing with the human body as a mechanical device, right? Okay. Now you, Tino and Giselle and anybody else here who's also a med student, you are in the early moments two beings. You're regular Tino from the block, right? Just like, I'm just a guy that, I like video games, presumably. Like, you're this regular old Tino, right? And then on the other hand, you are Dr. Tino, and right, like, you're that future moment, like whenever the guardian of the portal says that Samurai Jack can't come back yet, and until whatever, no one gets these references. But you're those two things, and you're having this like gestalt crisis whenever you encounter these things that are like legit, and that's raw. Does that make sense? That's raw. And I think that it's okay to lean into the rawness, because that by itself is the theme, right? This is about your transition from regular person to doctor. And that's an uncomfortable, weird transition. And we, the public, don't really ever get a chance to think about it. Like, we get like a lot of TV shows, I guess, but we don't get like the real. So I want to hear the raw thing. And so I would
Yeah.
say that I'm not as interested in stories as I am thematic connections. So I'm interested in you saying, yeah, I was in a class, like, you know how sometimes you go to a class and it's like, well, sit down and open your books to chapter 3. I had to sit down and open a human to the spleen, right? And so you can maybe just describe that, like, how does it feel? I don't know how a spleen feels. Describe that to us. That'll be fun for a minute.
Yeah.
And then maybe just leave it. And then the next voice we hear is the anatomy instructor talking about, you know, being humanistic lessons and that whole jam. And that's like, so my point is that, like, that's raw. It's not connected by
I see what
a
you're saying.
narrative
Yeah.
thing, but I don't think that it has to be.
Yeah.
I think that this is an experimental thing that you can do. This is not like an official, you know, recommendation or whatever. But I do wonder how it would sound if you focused on the feeling in the first place, and then this more reflective and measured, because ideally the instructor in this example is someone who guides people across this transition, right? Like this is the navigator on the
exactly,
right? So anyway, I guess that's what I would like to say about it. I do think the idea is great. I think that 30 minutes is possibly too long.
Okay.
I think that Invisibilia has a full-time staff of like quite a few people, sometimes including Eliza, who work an entire year to make 5 episodes. So I think that you want to think about what your production process is.
Totally. Yeah.
But it sounds like you kind of have already made something. Is that right?
I've made 5 episodes.
Okay, yeah. So I might just be. You might have already cracked the code on all of this, and I might.
Well, I don't know.
Like,
I kind of like this idea of talking more about my emotional response to it and just kind of leaning more into that. I think the one thing that I was worried about was that like people would get bored with like a single story, but I think that could be one way to make it more interesting.
I don't think that it has to be terribly long, right? I mean, you know, like we were hanging out at a party and you were like, so the other day I was holding a human heart. I'd be like, ladies and gentlemen, the new most interesting person at the party, Tino, will now tell us a few more things, right? So like, I think that it's okay. Anyway, yeah.
Okay.